Hi everyone. So this is the first of a series of tutorials in using the Python web server called Flask. Now, just to start, I thought I'd show you my current software environment. I'm using VS Code, which is a very good IDE. I have got Python installed, and I've got Python 3.10 and later would be okay. Um, I believe Flask comes with Python now, but just to check that Flask is installed, you will need to just use the pip installer. So to install Python or to check that it's installed, I would actually open up a terminal. If you're just using some other IDE, you may wish to open up the console, or if you're on an Apple computer, open up its terminal. But for myself, I'm in VS Code. I'm going to run the following command: pip tree install Flask, and that will ensure that Flask is installed. And you can see for myself, the requirements are already satisfied. So Flask is installed. You don't have to do this, but as we go along, I think it would be easier if you did do it. I've actually got a template that I created, and there's some extraneous files there that I'll be using in later tutorials. You don't have to do this, but I'd recommend it. And certainly, if you download my template, you'll get this code just to start you off. So my template is available on my GitHub. My GitHub account is Brad Nielsen 2981, and the repository that I've got this code under is basic Flask template. So I'd recommend downloading the code. You may wish to pull it in using your own GitHub account, or maybe just download the zip folder and start from there. There's not a lot to it, but it's just a way to start you off. And like I said, it will become useful in later tutorials. Okay, let's have a look at the basic Flask code and discuss what Flask is, because these tutorials are aimed for my year 11 and 12 students. And so for a lot of them, their experience of web servers is fairly limited. So where a web server is simply a program that runs on a computer, and its job is to deliver web content to the client. The client is often someone who has a web browser and makes contact to the web server using that web server's IP address, and then pulls down the web content from that web server. So this is essentially how the internet works. A lot of times you're making requests. Every time you internet surf, you're actually making a request to a web server. That web server's IP address is what you're hitting, but obviously every IP address actually has an alias, which is like the URL. So the URL is essentially an alias for the IP address. When we run Flask, it will deliver that web content to whoever's requesting it. For us, we're actually going to run this Flask web server on our own computers, and then we're going to load it up in our own web browser. So it's almost like we are both the server and the client. And I will discuss how that works. For the moment, though, I want to just quickly look at the libraries here. So for Flask to work, you have to bring in the Flask library and you have to import the functionality from it. You can import that functionality quite individually, and as we go along, we will be using Flask functions. But I think for the most part, it's easier just to import all that functionality at the beginning. The other two libraries I'm importing in are Python default libraries or standard libraries, sys and logging. Those two libraries will allow us to log to a file as we go along. I think with programming, sometimes the hardest thing is working out where your errors are going and detecting those errors. So I like to have a log to output to. So for Flask, we're going to set the log, and I've just created an empty text file called flask.log. I've stored it inside the logs folder, which you can see on the left here. And obviously I've been using it, so I'm just going to clear the log for the moment. You can always clear the log. But I think it's quite useful. And the other thing you can do is you can decrease the level of logging, which I like to do because sometimes I find the logging so verbose that it's actually hard to work out where the error is. So I've decreased the level of logging to 10. I believe by default it's like 100. Right. So that's the first two things I do. To create the web server, we actually create an application object, or a Flask object. So once we've imported in the Flask library, we then create a Flask object, and we can call that app. And when we are ready to run our web server, we use the following command: app.run, choose the IP address that you're going to run it on. I'm just going to run it on my own computer, and I'm going to give it a port. Now, year 11 and year 12 students may not understand what a port is. With networking, obviously, when you're on a network, you're sending and receiving packets from other computers. Now, because you could actually have more than one networked application on your computer, sometimes you need to work out where the packets are coming from and sort them accordingly. So the easiest way to do that is to use what's called network ports. Essentially, it's like a pigeonhole on your computer or a postal box. So when you might if you have a Minecraft server, then the packets might go to a certain port. If you are using a web browser, then the packets go to a certain port, which I think is like 443 or port 80, something like that. For us, we're actually just going to create our own little web server and run that on a port that's already in use. So port 5000 is most likely to be quite unique. And the other thing I've done is I've set the debug level to true, which is an important one because it means that every time we change our code, we don't necessarily have to restart the web server. Saying that, if you make massive changes, you may wish to stop the web server, restart the web server. But if you have debug is equal to true, you should just be able to, as you go along, change code, refresh your web browser, and see the changes automatically reflected. Okay, let's run the code first, and then we'll discuss what this does. So I'm going to press play. No, you won't have a play button unless you've got Python installed. You can see that it is now running. I've got debug mode on. And for me to see where it's running, I'm going to go to localhost and I'm going to type in port 5000. So back here, localhost port 5000, and you can see it says hello world. So localhost is my own computer. I'm running the web server there, and then I'm loading it within a web browser on my own computer as well. So we're kind of serving content to ourselves. But like I said, if you were interested and you are in a classroom and you've got other students there who are also using Flask, you may wish to just find out what their IP address is. They could change the output message there. And if you found out what their IP address is, and just to show how to find your own, if you go to command prompt, or if you're on an Apple machine, go to terminal. On command prompt, I can go ipconfig, and it's going to show me where I've got IPv4, that's my IP address. So I could put this up here, what my IP address is. Now that's my computer, but if you find out what your friend's IP address is, they might have 45 or something. Put in the IP address and you'll be hitting their computer. This is only going to work if you're in the same network lab, because private IP addresses, which is what we're dealing in, are different to public IP addresses. If you wanted to have this so that your web server is accessible across the internet, you would need to probably set up port forwarding on your modem so that when someone hits your home's IP address, it then gets forwarded to your own private one. Okay, I'll let you look into that. Let's quickly have a look at what the view function does, because we don't have much time left. Right, so a view function is essentially a route that comes after the URL, that immediately triggers Python code. So here we have app.root, and this is our home URL. And as soon as the web browser hits that particular root, it will run the view function below it. So for us, I've called this function login. You could actually call that function whatever you want, so long as it's not a reserved word and so long as the function doesn't already exist. So I've defined a function called login because this is going to eventually become a login page. I've just done some logging. I'm going to log it to my flask.log just to show you how. And then I'm just going to return the output hello world. And again, I could actually return anything I want here. So this is a view function. And when I run it, you can see this is my home URL. I'll just put a / in to show you. It's my home URL. You can see that is then returned the output hello world, blah, 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 blah. Okay, let's create another one. So I'm going to create another one called a register page. But this time I'm going to use the URL. I'm going to add the part of the URL called register, actually return register here. And I'm going to return login here. I don't have to do this, I'm just logging, but I will do it anyway. And so I'm going to run this code now, and I'm actually going to get an error. If you look down below, you'll notice it actually says view function mapping is overriding existing endpoint. And the reason for that is because these two functions have the same name. So I was saying before, you must have different names. So I'm going to change this function to register. And then I'm going to run it. And I'm hoping that debug mode still works. If it is a fatal error, I may need to, yes. So if you have a fatal error, which this was, you will need to stop your Flask web server and then run it again. So if you get a fatal error, you'll have to do that. If it's just small little things going along, you might find you don't need to change it because it's in debug mode. All right. So now if I go to my page, you can see login, that's the home account. And if I type in register, you can see I've got to the register page. If I go back to there's a /, Flask is actually, I think it's an easy way for students to learn because you really do understand how code is triggered using the URL. And let's just actually have a look at the Flask log because the Flask log's been logging this. You'll notice that on the Flask log, it actually detects both the GET request, and we'll discuss GET request in a second, but you can see it's doing the GET request. Initially, it looked for just the /, and then it detected a GET request for a register. Then it detected a GET request for the /. And you can see I'm just logging in some information as I go along as well. So the way a web browser works is it makes a GET request of a web server, and the web server responds to that GET request. As a bit of a challenge is create yourself another app.root and just have it like an about page and see if you can get that just returning whatever you want. Make sure that you can actually hit that page by changing the URL. Okay, thank you very much for listening.